The washwater had gone to ice at its edges before the sky ever thought to lighten, and Yulan knelt over it in the dark of the judge's scullery, with her sleeves pushed past her elbows, breaking the skin of frost with her knuckles, because there was no one to bring her hot. Her hands had stopped hurting an hour ago, which was worse than hurting. She scrubbed the judge's linen against the ridged board with her breath hanging white in front of her mouth, and she counted, not the shirts, but the days, though she had lost the true number of them somewhere back in the second winter. Under her rough tunic, warm against her breastbone where nothing else on this side of the ocean was warm, hung a small piece of pale green jade carved in the shape of a magnolia flower. Her mother had pressed it into her palm on the wharf at Canton and closed Yulan's fingers over it and said nothing, because there had been nothing left to say that the two of them had not already worn smooth with saying. Yulan never took it off. She kept it hidden under cloth, the way she kept hidden the single gold coin sewn into the hem of her one good jacket, and the way she kept hidden the thing that was harder to hide than either, the belief, small and stubborn as a seed under snow, that she had not crossed 9,000 miles of gray water only to die on her knees in another man's cold room. She was called a servant. The word was gentler than the truth. There was a paper. She had seen it once, the day the wagon brought her up the long drive to Judge Ambrose Thorne's White House at the edge of Feather Bend. A paper covered in the marching black marks of English she could not read, with a red seal and the judge's name written large, and beside it, a smaller mark a man in San Francisco had made her copy from his own hand. That mark was supposed to be her. That paper said she belonged to the household until a debt was paid, and the debt was a number she had never been told, in a language she could not sound out, growing in the dark like mold on bread. That first morning the judge had come down his own front steps to look at what he had bought, and walked around her once, slowly, the way a man walks around a horse he means to buy. He lifted her chin with one soft finger. His eyes were the color of river ice, and just as ready to give way beneath a body's weight. He said something to the driver, and the two men laughed, and Yulan stood very straight and looked at the mountains behind the house, gold with autumn, and let the laughter go past her like weather. Then a bolt slid shut somewhere at her back, and she was inside, and the mountains were on the other side of a wall. But there had been one thing the judge had not foreseen. Across the swept yard, in the shadow of the wide stable door, a man had stood holding a bridle and watched her come, and when the judge laughed, the man had not laughed. He was tall and stooped a little as tall men learn to stoop, dust-colored from hat to boot, with a quiet, closed face that gave away nothing at all. Nothing, except that when the judge lifted her chin, the man's jaw had tightened under the brim of his hat, and his knuckles had gone white on the leather, as though he had seen this exact thing done before, to someone, long ago, and had never once been able to forget it. Yulan learned the house the way a prisoner learns a cell, by the length of a chain. She learned which floors creaked and would wake the judge. Mrs. Devlin ran the indoors with a ring of keys and a mouth like a purse pulled shut, and she was not cruel so much as afraid all the time of the man who paid her, and she passed that fear down in slaps and in silences, and in a plate of scrapings set on the back step at night as if for a dog. Yulan ate the scrapings. She had eaten worse things than pride. There was no money. Yulan rose before the birds and lay down after the fires were banked, and at the end of a week there was no coin laid in her palm, and at the end of a year, the number in the black marks had, she was given to understand, grown larger rather than smaller, because the judge charged her for the roof and the scrapings and the very cloth on her back, more each season than her labor was allowed to earn. She had been sold to pay a debt and set to work paying it, and the work made the debt bigger. She turned this over on the nights she could not sleep, and each time it made the same shape, which was a shape with no door in it. The stable hand's name, she gathered from the way Mrs. Devlin barked it, was Owen. Owen Ror. He kept the horses and lived in a lean-to off the tack room and spoke to almost no one, and the town, which had opinions about everyone, had decided he was simple because he was quiet, which is the town's usual mistake. She and Owen did not speak. It would not have been permitted, and neither of them was a fool, but she began to notice things. The woodpile she could barely split began to have its largest rounds already halved when she came to it in the dark, the axe wiped and hung, no one about. And once, when the cold cracked down out of the high country and her hands split open at the knuckles, she found on the back step, beside her plate of scrapings, a pair of men's woolen gloves, worn soft, far too big, smelling of horse and of another human being's warmth. She put them on. She did not say thank you, because there was no one to say it to, and because if she had let herself say it, she might not have been able to stop at thank you. What she learned of the judge, she learned the way water learns a stone, slowly, from underneath. He was the law in Featherbend, and for 2 days ride around it. And the law there was whatever put money in Ambrose Thorne's strongbox. Men came up the drive with their hats in their hands and went away with less than they came with. There was a Chinese mining company on the river. 30 men on a claim the judge had decided he wanted. And one night, Yulan heard him at his brandy, telling a visitor exactly how a magistrate could make a claim not worth defending. And she stood in the dark of the hall with a tray going cold in her hands, and understood that the cruelty done to her was not a thing apart from the man. It was the man, and across the yard through the window she could see a lantern moving in the stable, small and steady, where Owen Ror sat up with a foaling mare, and for no reason she could have named. The sight of that one honest light steadied her hands. The first true word she ever had from him was over a wound that was not her own. The judge kept a bay gelding he rode too hard, and one raw morning it came back lame and torn where it had gone through wire, and the judge told Owen to see it right, or see himself gone, and rode off to his court. Yulan watched Owen crouch by the trembling horse, and saw the tear had gone bad, hot and swollen, and saw the set of his shoulders, and knew he did not know what to do, and knew that if the horse died, the blame would land on him and land hard. Her mother had been the woman the village came to, in the Delta, with fevers and cuts gone green, and Yulan had ground the roots at her elbow, since before she was tall enough to see over the table. Her feet took her across the yard before her caution could stop them. She had no words for him. A handful of English, hard little stones of it. Yes, no, water, please. Nothing for the way you must draw the heat out before you can close the flesh. So she knelt in the mud out of sight of the judge's windows, and showed him with her hands. She gathered the gray-green yarrow off the ditch bank as it grew wild at home under another name, and the broad plantain leaf that draws poison, and bruised them between 2 stones with a little water, and made him understand she must lay it on. He looked at her a long moment. His eyes were brown and tired, with something behind them held down so hard it made her own chest ache. Then he nodded once and moved to hold the horse's head, murmuring low and steady while she worked, and the horse, which trusted him, stood. When it was bound and the swelling had someone at last on its side, Owen Ror sat back on his heels in the mud and said, in a voice rough from disuse, the first words, "Where'd you learn that?" She had not enough of his language to answer, so she touched her own breastbone, where the jade lay, and made with her hands the shape of a smaller person, and pointed at the earth, at the far side of the whole gray world, and said the one word she had, "Mother." And Owen looked at the ground as if he could see clear through it to the other side, and said, so quietly she almost missed it, "Mine too." Then the judge's buggy turned in at the gate, and they were 2 strangers on opposite sides of a lame horse, and neither of them looked at the other again all that day. After that, the yard was not the same yard. They stole their sentences the way starved people steal bread, in the seams of the day, at the woodpile before light, in the blue dusk when Yulan carried scraps to the hens, and Owen forked hay with a fence between. He taught her words, the names of things she could touch, halter, latch, flint, mercy, run, and she gave him back the shapes of her own tongue, and once she taught him the word her mother had called her by, samgon, which meant heart and liver, the thing a person cannot live without, and he tried it in his heavy mouth and got it wrong, and she laughed for the first time in that house, a small sound she clapped her own hand over, frightened by it. And in those stolen seams she learned his wound, a little at a time, the way you learn the depth of a well by dropping a stone and counting. He had come over as a boy, in the years the potato turned black in the ground in his country. His mother had not lived to see the water. His father had died on it. He had come off the boat at Boston with a little sister by the hand, Nellie, 7 years old, with a blue ribbon their mother had tied there in another life, and men there had a way with children who had no one. "A paper," he said, and his jaw went hard. "Always a paper. Marks a child cannot read, that say the child's years belong to a man now, in exchange for bread." They had been bound out, the 2 of them, to different houses, because that was cheaper. He to a stable and a forge, Nellie to a mill. The rest came out of him over many dusks, in pieces with rough edges, and Yulan held each piece and did not let it fall. He had run from his own binding, older by then, meaning to buy his sister free with wages he did not yet have, and had walked 200 miles and knocked at the mill's counting house in the rain with the money in his fist, and a clerk had told him, not unkindly, that the girl Nellie had died of the fever in the spring, worked thin and taken quick, and been put in the ground behind the meeting house, and did he want the marker paid for, it was extra. Owen had been holding a blue ribbon in his coat all that long walk, the one their mother tied. He was holding it still. He carried it yet. He told her this in the near dark, with his hands very still on the hay fork, and when he was done, neither of them spoke, and Yulan reached her hand through the rails of the fence. Palm up, the way she had shown him wait, only now it did not mean wait. And after a long moment, Owen put his rough, enormous, careful hand over her small, cold one, and they stood like that, two people who had each been sold once as children by men with papers, while the light went out of the sky over the White House. And Yulan understood, standing there, that she was going to run, and that the understanding had come not as a thought, but as a certainty in the body, the way you know a storm by the ache in an old break. And she understood one thing more, which frightened her worse than the judge, that she did not want to run alone. She began her plan the only way she knew, in silence and in inches. The gold coin was the beginning of it, a single American half-eagle sewn into her hem. $5 in gold she had guarded through every hunger. Because it was not money to her, it was a door. Passage on a coastal steamer to San Francisco, to the tall, narrow streets full of her own people. And somewhere in that crowd, she let herself believe, a way to earn her bread as a free woman. $5 was not enough to do all of it, but it was enough to begin, and beginning was the thing the paper was built to make impossible. She learned the shape of the days. The judge rode the circuit 4 times a year, gone 3 nights each time, and Mrs. Devlin took to her bed with the brandy the moment his buggy was out the gate. One dog would bark at a stranger, the other would not lift its head for anyone it had smelled before. The moon would be dark in the last week of the month, and a coastal boat left the landing at Marysville, a day and a half's ride south and west, on market mornings. She turned these things over until they fit together like the pieces of her mother's puzzle box, and the shape they made, at last, was a shape with a door in it. A small door. A door you would have to be desperate to fit through. She was desperate enough. But there was the paper, and the paper she could not solve alone, because she could not read it, and did not know what the law would do to a woman who ran from a magistrate's own house. Whether the whole weight of the county would come down the roads after her, or whether, once among her own people, the marks on the page would lose their power the way a curse loses its power when you cross the right river. She needed a man who could read English, and she knew that to ask him was to ask him to lay his own life on the same fire that had already taken one person from him. She asked him at the woodpile, before light, when frost furred the axe handle. She said, "I go." She said, "San Francisco." She said, "The paper." And she took from inside her tunic not the coin, but the jade magnolia, and held it out in the dark on her open palm, the whole of her hidden heart lying there in the cold, because she had no English to say. "I trust you with the thing my mother gave me," so she said it with the jade. Owen looked at the pale green stone and did not touch it. His breath came white and fast. And then, to her horror, he stepped back from her, 1 step, and shook his head, and turned and walked into the stable and pulled the door shut. And Yulan stood alone in the black cold with her mother's jade in her open hand, and the whole seed of her hope frozen in her chest, and did not know if she had just lost the only thing left to lose. For 3 days he would not meet her eyes. She thought she had killed it. She told herself she would go alone, with no man's help, and almost believed she could. And then, on the 3rd night, the thing happened that turned Owen Ror inside out. Judge came home early from his brandy in a black temper and took his riding crop to the half-grown town orphan who mucked the far stalls. A boy named Tom, in the yard in the torchlight over nothing at all, over the shape of the boy's face. And Yulan at the kitchen window saw Owen cross that yard in 4 strides and catch the judge's arm at the top of its swing and hold the arm of the man who owned his bread, in one enormous hand, while the whole world held its breath. The judge did not shout. That was the terrible thing. He lowered the crop and smiled and said something quiet, and Owen let go and stood with his head down while the judge went into the house, and the boy Tom crawled away to the tack room to bleed. And later, when the house was dark and the judge slept the sleep of a man who has never once lain awake, Owen came to the kitchen step where Yulan waited, because she had known, watching from the window, that he would. He crouched in front of her in the dark, his breathing not steady, and took her cold hand and turned it palm up and pressed into it a scrap of cloth, small and worn, and she felt with her fingers what it was. A child's hair ribbon, gone soft and colorless. And she understood what he was giving her, and what he was saying without any words at all. He was saying, "Not again." He was saying, "Not while I have hands." He folded her fingers over Nellie's ribbon, the way her mother had folded her fingers over the jade on the wharf at Canton, and he said, in his low, rough voice, the only word of her language he had ever gotten right, "Sam, gone. Heart and liver, the thing you cannot live without." Then he told her the plan was 3 nights off, when the judge rode the circuit, and that he was coming with her as far as the river, and that she was to be ready. The night of the dark moon came in cold and starless, with a wind off the mountains that covered small sounds. And Yulan stood at the scullery door with everything she owned upon her body, the jade at her breast, the coin in her hem, the blue ribbon knotted at her wrist, and over it all, Owen's 2 big gloves, and waited for the single owl call he had promised. When it came, she went out low and quick, past the dog that had smelled her 1,000 times and did not lift its head, to the stable where he waited with the gelding saddled and a second horse behind it. He had the paper. That was the thing that stopped her heart. He had gone into the judge's own study while the man was away and taken it from the strongbox, because, he breathed as he cupped his hands for her foot, a magistrate could send the county after a runaway servant, but not so easily after a paper that no longer existed. She put her foot in his hands, and he lifted her into the saddle as though she weighed nothing, and swung onto the second horse, and they walked the animals slow and muffled down the back of the drive, and the white house sank into the dark behind them, and for 100 heartbeats Yulan let herself believe the door had opened and she had fit through it. Then a dog she did not know began to bark. The far dog, the mean one, chained by the smokehouse where the wind had hidden it. And a lantern flared yellow in an upstairs window that should have been empty, and a man's voice bawled out across the yard, and boots hit the ground running. The judge had left a man. His name, though Yulan did not know it yet, was Coyle, and Coyle came out of the bunkhouse with a rifle and no coat and murder in his voice, and behind him 2 more. Owen's hand came down hard on the rump of Yulan's gelding, and he shouted the word he had taught her at the woodpile, the word she had turned over so many nights. "Run! Run!" And the horse leapt under her, and the cold wind tore the breath from her mouth, and she ran. She ran into the black country south of the house with her hair coming loose and her heart in her teeth. And behind her, she heard the second horse's hooves, and did not know, for one endless stretch of pounding dark, whether they were the hooves of the man who had given her his sister's ribbon, or the hooves of a man come to drag her back. They were his. He came up out of the dark on her flank, low over the second horse's neck, and he did not turn back at the road the way the plan had been. He came past the fork where he was meant to peel away, past his own last chance to stay behind. And when she looked over at him, wild-eyed, asking him without words what he was doing, Owen looked back, and there was nothing closed in his face anymore, nothing held down, and he shouted over the wind and the hooves, the thing that answered everything, "Not letting you go alone." And so the man who had watched cruelty from the shadow of a stable door for years without a word, ran out of that shadow at last, and ran with her, and the 2 of them rode south into the dark ahead of the judge's men, hunted, together, and the road unspooled, black and endless before them, and behind them, the lanterns of Feather Bend swung and shrank, and would not stop coming. They ran the horses until the animals could not run, and then they walked them, and then they hid. By day they lay up in the folds of the foothill country and slept in turns with one always watching the back trail, and by night they moved south under the wheel of stars with the horses' hooves muffled in sacking. Owen tore from his own shirt. They had almost nothing but the herbs Yulan gathered as they went, because she could not help gathering them, her mother's habit in her hands. And they had, now that the doing was past, and only the enduring remained, each other, close in a way the fence between them had never let them be, and Yulan discovered that the nearness she had ached toward for a year was made not of grand things, but of small ones. The way he laid his coat over her when he thought she slept, the way their hands learned each other passing the bread. On the 3rd night, Coil's men nearly had them at a shallow ford, and it was there that Owen took the hurt. He put the second horse between Yulan and the far bank, where shapes rose up out of the willows, and something cracked flat across the water, and Owen grunted and swayed, but did not fall. And they went up the black cut bank and lost the men in a maze of dry gullies he seemed to know by the stars, and it was near dawn before she could get him down in a hidden draw and see by the gray light that the ball had gone along his ribs and left a furrow bleeding steady into his waistband. She built no fire for the smoke, but chewed the yarrow to a paste with her own teeth and packed the furrow and bound it tight with strips of her one clean underskirt. And when she sat back on her heels shaking, he lifted his big hand, slow, and with one blunt finger touched the jade that had swung free of her collar as she worked, and said, thick with hurt and with something else, "Tell me about her. Your mother, so I don't fall asleep." And so, on the run with a hunted man bleeding under her fingers, Yulan told him about the delta and the wet green fields, and the woman who had known every route and had folded the jade into her daughter's hand on the wharf. And as she talked, the light came up gold over the strange western hills, and Owen fell asleep at last with his hand loosely closed around the jade and his head against her knee, and Yulan sat very still so as not to wake him, and felt the thing she had been refusing to feel come up in her at last, warm and terrible, filling her chest the way spring water fills a stone basin, silent and endless. They came down out of the high country on the 5th day, and Marysville lay before them in the bend of 2 rivers, and it had a Chinatown. She smelled it before she saw it, the char of roast pork and the sweetness of joss smoke and, under it, the musk of dried herbs that was the smell of her mother's back room. The smell of home carried 9,000 miles, and something broke open in her chest, and Owen felt her go rigid in the saddle, and there were the red paper lanterns strung above a narrow lane, and the black and gold signboards she could not read, but under which she was, for the first time since the wharf at Canton, not the only one of her kind. But they could not simply ride in. A hurt man and a Chinese woman on 2 of Judge Thorne's own horses would be marked in an hour, and Yulan knew that Coil would think of the Chinatown too, precisely because it was where she would run, and would be there waiting, with the paper. He was. He found them on the 2nd morning, in the narrow lane under the red lanterns, where Yulan had gone at last, veiled in a borrowed shawl, to beg help of an old herbalist named Wu, whose shop smelled of her mother, and who had sent a boy running with a word she did not catch. Coil came into the lane with 2 men, and the rolled paper held up in his fist like a torch, and a sweating, unhappy town constable to make it lawful, and called out the false flat name the paper gave her, and told the constable to take her, she was Judge Ambrose Thorne's bound servant, run from her lawful place, and the paper said so, and the paper was the law. And the lane went quiet, and Owen Ror, pale and swaying with his ribs strapped under his shirt, stepped out of Wu's doorway and put himself between the rifle and the woman, the way he had put the horse between her and the ford, and said, in a voice that did not carry far but did not need to, "That paper's a lie, and I can read, and you can't, and I'll say what's on it in front of this constable and every soul in this street." Coil's face did an ugly thing, and into the silence, before he could decide to be stupid with the rifle, Wu came out into the lane, and behind him 4 men, and behind them more. Merchants of the District Association in dark coats with their hands quiet at their sides. The men who looked after their own, because in this country no one else would. And one of them, a broad, calm man with a lawyer's card in his pocket and better English than Coil would ever own, held out his hand to the constable and said he would very much like the paper read aloud, all of it, the sums and the dates and the name of the man who had signed as creditor, here, now, in the daylight, before witnesses. And the constable, who wanted only to be somewhere else and did not love Ambrose Thorne, took the paper out of Coil's fist and gave it to Owen and told him to read. Owen read. He read the marching black marks slow and steady in the red lantern light, the marks that had ruled Yulan's life for 2 winters, the debt that was never a debt, a sum she had never borrowed, dated to a day she had been on the ocean, charging a woman for her own passage, and her own keep, and her own body's labor, and compounding it season on season, so it could never, by any work of any hands, grow smaller. Then he read the 2 names at the bottom, and stopped, and read them again so the whole lane could hear, the creditor who claimed the money, and the magistrate who had sealed the claim as lawful. They were the same name. Ambrose Thorne had lent the money to himself and judged himself right to collect it, and there it was in his own hand for all to see. And the calm man with the lawyer's card said, gently, that no court in California would call that a debt, and that he would be glad, personally, to carry it to the district court and to the newspapers both. And Coyle looked around the lane at the quiet men and the watching windows, and he was a bully and not a fool, and he lowered the rifle. It was Yulan who ended it. She came forward out of the shawl into the light where they could all see her, and she stood very straight the way she had stood in the judge's yard while men laughed, and she took the paper from Owen's hands, the paper she had never been able to read, and looked up and found the herbalist's brazier glowing at the mouth of the lane where the joss sticks burned, and carried the paper to it, and fed her whole false debt into the coals with her own 2 hands. It caught and curled, and the red seal blackened and cracked, and the marks that had said she was a thing to be owned went up in a thin gold flame and a curl of smoke that smelled, for one moment, like every offering her mother had ever burned to the ancestors, and was gone. And in the quiet after, Owen Ror turned to her in front of the whole gathered street and said, not low this time, not stolen in the seam of a day, but out loud for anyone in 2 worlds to hear. Marry me. I've got no house and no name worth much, and one country that threw me out, and another that don't want either of us. But I've got 2 hands, and they're yours, and I'm done watching from a stable door. And Yulan, who had crossed 9,000 miles of gray water and believed in a seed under snow, put her hand into his enormous, ruined, careful hand in front of them all, and said the one word she was sure of, the word he had taught her at the woodpile that meant the opposite of everything the paper had meant. Yes. They did not go to San Francisco after all, and Yulan never spent the gold coin on passage anywhere. They married in the Marysville Chinatown, with the herbalist Wu standing as her family because she had none, and a circuit preacher who did not care what the town thought standing as his, and the district merchants sent a roast pig and hung fresh lanterns, and Owen wore a borrowed coat and could not stop looking at her. The scandal of it ran up and down the county for a season. A Chinese woman and an Irish stable hand, the runaways who had burned a magistrate's paper in the open street. But the scandal of Ambrose Thorne ran farther and hit harder, for the paper Owen had read aloud found its way to the district court and to 2 newspapers, and other men who had gone up that white drive with their hats in their hands found their voices at last. And within the year, the judge was a judge no longer, and the Chinese company got its claim on the riverback, and Featherbend learned, slowly, to be a little ashamed. Owen took work at a livery in a fair-sized river town, and in time the livery was his, and beside it, in a narrow storefront with a red lantern by the door, Yulan set up as her mother had been, steeping the barks and grinding the roots, listening with folded hands to the fevers and coughs and cuts gone green of a whole muddy town that learned, one healing at a time, to knock at her door and take off its hat. The gold coin she had hoarded through every hunger, the door she had meant to open to a passage home. She drilled a small hole through one autumn morning and hung on a red thread beside the jade magnolia at her throat, because she had understood at last that the passage she had needed had never been across the water. It had been out of the stable door and into the light, and she had already made it. And the blue ribbon, Nellie's ribbon, gone soft and colorless with a dead child's short life and a grieving man's long guilt, that Owen tied one spring into the black hair of their first daughter with hands that shook, and did not weep until the child had toddled off, and Yulan held him while he shook, and neither of them said the name of the girl who had died in a mill so that this girl could live free, but both of them heard it, in the wind off the river, in the red lantern creaking on its hook. The years went the way the good years go, quickly and without spectacle. There were 3 children and then grandchildren, and a house that was theirs down to the last nail, and a shop full of drawers that smelled of Yulan's mother 40 years away. Owen never learned to say Sam gone right, and it became a joke between them. The mangled word he had gotten wrong the first time in the judge's yard, so that heart and liver, the thing you cannot live without, was in their house always a little clumsy and a little funny and entirely true. On an evening near the end of a long life, Yulan sat on the porch of that house with the sun going down gold over the river, the way it had gone down gold over the mountains the first morning of her selling, when they had been on the wrong side of a wall. Owen slept in his chair beside her, with his enormous, ruined, careful hand open on his knee. Her own hand had gone thin and spotted, and in it she held the jade magnolia her mother had folded there on the wharf at Canton, warm now from her own skin, and beside it, on the red thread, the gold coin she had never spent. And she thought of the girl who had knelt over ice water in the dark, counting days she had lost the number of, and found she could not quite reach that girl anymore, could not quite remember being so cold, and was glad. A granddaughter came out onto the porch, home from a school Yulan had never dreamed her blood would sit in, and knelt at her grandmother's knee and asked to hold the green stone, the way she asked every evening. And Yulan folded the child's fingers over the jade, the way her mother had folded hers, the way Owen had folded hers over a dead girl's ribbon in the dark, and closed the small hand shut and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the whole of her life had not already worn smooth with saying, "And the river went gold, and the lantern glowed red by the door, and the old man slept, and it was enough. So I'll leave you there, on that porch, with the light going down and the jade warm in a child's fist. But let me ask you something before the fire burns low. If you had been Yulan, kneeling in that cold water, with a paper you couldn't read owning your very days, would you have found the courage to hold out your mother's jade to a quiet man across a fence and trust him with the whole of your hidden heart? I'd truly love to know what you would have done. Tell me down in the comments, because I read every one of them by the fire. And if this story warmed something in you, if you believe, like Yulan did, that a seed can hold under snow and a person can walk out of the dark into the light, then stay with me and subscribe, and pull your chair a little closer, because I've got another one to tell you, and the lantern's still lit.